She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't throw a single thing. She just looked at the woman sitting in her kitchen barefoot, comfortable, wearing her robe, and something inside her went completely quiet. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of a woman who just watched 9 years of her life become a lie. Sora Min, 29 years old, her husband's executive assistant, drinking from Amara's late mother's porcelain cup like she owned the place, because maybe, in ways Amara hadn't let herself see, she already did. If that were you, if you walked through your own front door at midnight and found that, what would you do? Because Amara Vance didn't beg. She didn't bargain. She walked upstairs, pulled out the same black suitcase she had before she ever became Mrs. Juan, and started packing the only things that were ever truly hers. And the most powerful man in the room? He stepped away from the door. If this story already has you gripping your seat, please take just 2 seconds right now to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stories like this one are what this channel is built for, and I don't want you missing what comes next. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into. The rain had been falling over Manhattan for 3 hours by the time Amara Vance's car turned off Fifth Avenue. It wasn't supposed to be tonight. Her flight from Washington wasn't scheduled until Wednesday. But the fundraiser had ended a full day, early a speaker cancellation, a scheduling collapse, something bureaucratic and forgettable. And when the option came to take an earlier flight home, Amara had chosen it without a second thought. She was tired. She missed her own bed. She missed the particular silence of the house at midnight when Dae-Hyun was already asleep and the city outside felt far away. That was what she told herself she missed. The silence. She had stopped questioning whether she missed him. The driver pulled through the iron gate without being asked. He knew the address, knew the code, knew the particular way the gravel sounded different on the left side of the driveway, because of the drainage problem Dae-Hyun kept promising to fix. Little things. Amara had cataloged a decade of little things about a life that looked, from the outside, like something out of a magazine spread. She thanked the driver, pulled her overnight bag from the back seat, and walked toward the front door. The house was lit. That was the first thing she noticed. Not all the lights, just the kitchen. That warm amber glow spilling out through the side window, the one that faced the garden, the one she could see from the driveway if she angled her head just slightly to the left. She didn't think anything of it. Dae-Hyun sometimes worked late at the kitchen island when he didn't want to sit in his office. Sometimes he left lights on without thinking. He was a man of enormous precision in business and surprising carelessness at home, and Amara had learned over the years to find the gap between those two versions of him charming. She had stopped finding it charming approximately 3 years ago, though she hadn't told him that. She turned her key in the lock, pushed the door open, set her bag down on the entry table, and walked toward the kitchen. And stopped. Sora Min was sitting at the marble island. She had a cup of tea in both hands, Amara's late mother's porcelain cup, the pale green one with the small chip on the handle that Amara had never been able to throw away, and she was holding it the way you hold something familiar. Comfortable, like she knew exactly how it felt in her palms because she had held it before. She was barefoot. She was wearing Amara's champagne silk anniversary robe. The belt was tied in a knot that Amara recognized the way she'd recognize her own name. Dae-Hyun always tied robes and belts with 2 loops and a pull-through, a habit from childhood, something his grandmother had taught him. Amara used to tease him about it. The knot was his. Sora looked up. For exactly 1 second, something crossed her face, not guilt, not panic, something quieter and more calculated. Then she arranged her expression into something almost polite. "Mrs. Kwan," she said, "you're home early." Amara didn't respond. She stood in the doorway of her kitchen and looked at this 29-year-old woman sitting at her island, drinking from her mother's cup, wearing the robe Dae-Hyun had given her for their 7th anniversary, tied in his knot, barefoot on Amara's kitchen floor. And she understood, completely, without a single additional piece of information. She had suspected, in the way you suspect a storm before the clouds fully form. Coldness here, an unexplained hour there, Dae-Hyun's phone turned face down on the nightstand when it never used to be. She had pushed those suspicions down so many times that pushing them down had become a kind of reflex, automatic and almost painless. You can train yourself not to feel things if you practice long enough. But you cannot train yourself not to see things. And right now she was seeing everything. "Where is he?" Amara asked. Her voice was even, terrifyingly even, though she didn't know that yet. She would only understand later, months later, that the evenness in her voice in that moment was not composure. It was the sound of a woman who had just stopped caring about the answer. Sora set the cup down carefully. He had a late meeting. "He'll be back." One word. Sora stopped. Amara looked at her for another moment. Then she turned, walked back to the entry table, picked up her overnight bag, and went upstairs. She did not slam a single door. She walked into the bedroom, their bedroom, the room where she had slept beside Dae-Hyun for 9 years, and went directly to the closet. She reached past the row of his suits on the left side, past the shelf where he kept his watches, and pulled down the black suitcase from the top shelf. The same suitcase she had arrived with, the one she'd owned before this house, before this name, before any of this. She set it on the bed and opened it, and stood there for a moment, looking at the empty interior. Then she started packing. Not her designer clothes. Not the jewelry. Not the things that had accumulated in this bedroom. Like evidence of a life she had chosen, she left all of it. The earrings he'd bought her in Seoul, the silk blouses she'd worn to his business dinners, the shoes that hurt her feet but looked appropriate. She packed her grandmother's bracelet from the top dresser drawer, her mother's photograph from the nightstand, 7 dresses she had owned before she met him, and 3 composition notebooks she found at the back of the closet shelf, dusty and slightly warped from a leak that had been repaired 2 winters ago. She held one of the notebooks for a moment, opened to the first page. 63 bars of an unfinished piano composition. She had written them 4 years into the marriage, in a single sitting at 3 in the morning, while Dae-Hyun was in Shanghai. She had never shown them to anyone. She put the notebook in the suitcase. She was zipping it closed when she heard him. The bedroom door opened and Dae-Hyun filled it. He was still in his suit, no tie, the top button undone, his face carrying the particular carefully controlled expression he wore when he had already been told something he didn't want to hear. He had called ahead. Of course he had. Sora had called him the moment Amara went upstairs. He was 51 years old, and he had been feared by serious men for most of his adult life. There was a stillness to him that most people read as power. His employees moved differently around him. His rivals measured their words. Even the federal investigators who had circled Quan Meridian Group for years spoke about him with something that wasn't quite respect, but sat close enough to it to be uncomfortable. He looked at the suitcase on the bed, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, something moved across his face that Amara had never seen there before. Fear Amara. She didn't look up. Let me explain. She picked up the suitcase and set it on the floor. She checked the zipper once. Then she looked at him. "I'm not leaving my home, Dae-Hyun," she said. He exhaled, his shoulders dropping slightly, relief moving through him before he could stop it. "I'm leaving yours." The relief vanished. He stood very still. He was good at still. It was one of the things she had once found compelling about him, the way he occupied a room, without needing to fill it with noise. But right now, the stillness felt different. It felt like a man who had been handed a problem he didn't have a strategy for. "You can't," he stopped himself. Tried again. "Where are you going?" "It doesn't matter, Amara." His voice changed, dropped into something lower. Not threatening. Something closer to exposed. "We need to talk about this." She picked up her bag. "We needed to talk about this 3 years ago," she said. "We needed to talk about a lot of things. That window is closed." He moved, not blocking her path, but shifting slightly into the space between her and the door. Not a deliberate obstruction. Something older than that, a physical reflex, the instinct of a man who controlled everything around him, reaching for one last lever of control. Amara looked at him. "Are you going to stop me?" The question was simple. No emotion in it. The same way you'd ask someone if they'd remembered to lock a door. The longest 3 seconds of Dae-Hyun's life passed. Then he stepped away from the door. She walked past him. Down the hallway, down the stairs, through the entry, past the kitchen where Sora was no longer sitting. She had retreated somewhere, wisely, and through the front door. She did not look back. The rain had gotten heavier. Her coat was inside. She stood for a moment on the front step with the suitcase in one hand and her bag in the other and let the rain hit her face. Then she walked to the street and called a car. No bodyguard appeared at the door. No command came through the intercom. No call lit up her phone. She waited in the rain for 7 minutes with her old black suitcase at her feet, and when the car arrived, she got in and gave the driver an address in Brooklyn. The mansion gate closed behind her. Tessa Monroe answered the door in a faded conservatory sweatshirt and the expression of someone who had been half asleep and was now suddenly completely alert. She looked at Amara, at the suitcase. At Amara's soaked coat, she had grabbed it from the car, she realized distantly. She didn't remember doing that. At Amara's face. "Come in," Tessa said, "no questions." Not yet. That was the thing about Tessa. She had known Amara since they were 22 and sharing a practice room at the Manhattan Conservatory. And she understood that some moments required silence before they required words. The apartment was small in the way that Brooklyn apartments were honest about being small, not pretending to be anything other than a third-floor walk-up with exposed brick and a window that rattled when the subway passed 3 blocks away. The kitchen was the size of a hotel bathroom. The bookshelves overflowed. There were 2 mismatched chairs in the living room and a battered upright piano against the far wall that Tessa had been hauling from apartment to apartment since graduate school. Amara sat in one of the mismatched chairs and looked at her hands. "He was sleeping with his assistant," she said. Tessa sat across from her. Said nothing. "She was in my kitchen, wearing my robe. The anniversary one." Amara paused. "She was drinking from my mother's cup." "Oh, Amara," I didn't yell at her. Amara looked up. "I don't know if that's strength or if I was just in shock. I genuinely cannot tell you which one it was. Does it matter right now?" "It might matter later." Tessa leaned forward. "Do you need—" "I need to stay here." The words came out before Amara finished the thought. "Just for tonight." "You can stay as long as you need," Tessa said. Couch pulls out. "It's not comfortable. I'll be honest with you. The middle bar will find your spine by 3 in the morning, but you're welcome to it for as long as you want it." Something loosened in Amara's chest. "Not much. Just enough." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Tell me what you need right now, in this moment, tonight." Amara thought about it. "A shower," she said, "and whatever that is on your stove." Tessa glanced at the kitchen. "That's leftover lentil soup from Tuesday. It's better than it has any right to be. That'll do." She stayed 3 nights before she acknowledged she wasn't leaving. The pull-out couch was exactly as brutal as Tessa had promised, and by the 3rd morning Amara had developed a crick in her neck that she addressed with a heating pad borrowed from Tessa's bathroom cabinet. She hadn't brought enough clothing. She borrowed Tessa's things, which were looser and softer than anything in her own wardrobe, and somehow more comfortable for it. She didn't return Dae-Hyun's calls. She read his texts without responding. There were 7 of them, over the first 4 days' careful texts, she noticed, not demanding ones. He wasn't commanding her to come home. He was asking if she was safe. He was telling her the suitcase hurt to look at. He was saying things she would have given anything to hear 3 years ago, and now they landed wrong, too late, like flowers brought to a funeral. On the 4th morning, she called the Brooklyn Center for Music Arts and asked if they needed adjunct faculty for intermediate piano. They needed someone to start Monday. She took the job. She had taught before. Before Dae-Hyun, she had taught private lessons out of a cramped studio on the Upper West Side, a roster of 15 students, ranging in age from 8 to 64, and she had loved it with an intensity that surprised even her. She loved the moment when someone stopped thinking about their hands and started thinking about the music. She loved the particular look on a student's face when something they had been fighting for weeks finally clicked. She had given all of that up when she married him. It hadn't been a demand. That was the thing she would spend months untangling. It hadn't been a direct command. Dae-Hyun had never said stop teaching, stop performing, stop composing. But his world had a gravity to it, a pull that bent everything around him into his orbit. Dinners became obligations. Weekends became events. Her evenings, the hours that used to belong to practicing, composing, sitting at the piano in the dark, turning feelings into sounds became available to him, and he'd used them, and she'd let him. And eventually, she'd stopped noticing what she'd given away. The grand piano he'd bought her in year 3 of the marriage had become furniture. She had played it, over the years, in the way that people maintain skills they're not using occasionally, carefully, without real investment. Like visiting a house you used to live in, just to check that it was still standing. On her 6th morning at Tessa's apartment, she woke at 4:30 and couldn't go back to sleep. She lay on the pull-out couch for 20 minutes, listening to the subway rumble in the distance. Then she got up, walked into the living room, and sat down at Tessa's battered upright. She didn't turn the light on. She played in the dark. At first, just scales. C major, then G, then D. Her fingers finding the shapes automatically. The muscle memory still there after all this time. She moved into Hanan exercises boring, repetitive, essential. The kind of practice she used to do every morning at 7 before she had a husband who needed breakfast before 7:30. And then, without deciding to, she started playing something else. 4 bars, unfinished. She had written them in a notebook 4 years ago at 3 in the morning in Seoul while Dae-Hyun slept across the hall in the hotel suite, and she had sat at the room's upright and put into music something she couldn't say out loud. She played the 4 bars. Then she kept going. She didn't know how long she played. The sky outside Tessa's window went from black to dark gray to something approaching dawn. She was aware dimly that she was crying, not dramatically, not sobbing, just the kind of quiet tears that happen when something long blocked is finally allowed to move. When she stopped, she became aware of Tessa standing in the hallway doorway. Tessa was crying too. She wasn't hiding it. "I've heard you play before," Tessa said quietly. "Recitals. The thing you did at Carnegie, the alumni concert. I've heard you. But I've never—" She stopped, pressed her hand to her mouth briefly. That was something else. Amara looked at the piano. Keys in the low light. "I forgot this belonged to me," she said. She started teaching Monday morning. The Brooklyn Center for Music Arts occupied the 2nd and 3rd floors of a narrow building on Atlantic Avenue, sandwiched between a Caribbean restaurant and a nail salon. Practice rooms were small, and the building's heating system operated on its own mysterious schedule. The piano in room 4 had a B-flat that stuck when the humidity was high. Amara loved it immediately and without reservation. Her students ranged from a 7-year-old named Precious, who had an unnerving natural ear, to a 68-year-old retired postal worker named Frederick, who had always wanted to learn and was making good on a promise he'd made to his late wife. On her first day, Frederick handed her a worn photograph of his wife, sitting at an upright piano, and said, "She played." I never learned to listen to what she was really saying. I'd like to, even now. Amara had to look at the floor for a moment. She started composing in earnest after her 2nd week of teaching. Not the tentative, occasional writing she'd done during her marriage, real composition, the kind that required hours and full presence, and the willingness to sit with something ugly and unresolved until it became honest. She wrote at night, on Tessa's upright, sometimes until 1 or 2 in the morning, when the apartment building was quiet and the only sounds were the occasional taxi and the heating pipes clicking. Tessa stopped complaining about the noise after the first night. "Don't stop for my sake," she said on her way to bed one evening. "I sleep better when I can hear it." 3 weeks after Amara left, Dae-Hyun's empire began to come apart. Elias Kwan found the gap during a routine audit, a discrepancy in the shipping schedules for the East Coast port operations, a timing irregularity that shouldn't have existed if the access schedules were being used correctly. He pulled the logs, ran them through the system, and discovered that the credentials in question belonged to Sora Min. He called Dae-Hyun from a secure line at 2 in the morning. "How long?" Dae-Hyun asked. "The earliest access we can confirm is 7 months ago." "Pattern suggests longer." Elias paused. Dae-Hyun. She had acquisition documents, port contracts, the gray line carrier schedule, things that were never part of her authorized access. The silence on Dae-Hyun's end lasted almost 10 seconds. Who did she pass them to? We're tracing it, but there are communications to an outside party. I'm cross-referencing now. Another pause. Dae-Hyun. I think it goes to Victor. Victor Han had been with Quan Meridian for 11 years. He managed the East Coast logistics operations, the legal side, the above-board carrier contracts and port agreements. He was methodical and precise, and Dae-Hyun had trusted him the way he trusted few people, which was to say cautiously, but genuinely. Victor, Dae-Hyun repeated. There's a rival network trying to move on the port operations. I've had intelligence about them for months, but they were moving slowly. Nothing that triggered our threshold. Now, I think they were moving slowly because they had an inside channel. They were waiting for the right time. Dae-Hyun stared at the wall of his West Village hotel room. He had moved the mansion 3 days after Amara left, not because of any specific plan, but because he could not figure out how to exist in that house without her in it. And existing in it without her felt like a lie he was telling himself. When would the right time be? When you were distracted, Elias said. When your attention was somewhere else. The room was very quiet. Sora knew Amara's travel schedule, Dae-Hyun said. Yes, she knew when Amara was coming back early. Elias let that sit for a moment. The original return date was Wednesday. The change happened last minute, but Sora had access to the household calendar. She would have known the flight was changed. Dae-Hyun understood. He had known, in some buried part of himself, from the moment Elias said Victor's name. The affair had been real. He would not insult Amara or himself by denying that, by trying to make it something that happened to him rather than something he had chosen. But the circumstances had been managed. Visibility had been managed. Sora had made sure Amara would walk into that kitchen. She had made sure there would be no ambiguity, no way for Amara to convince herself. She hadn't seen what she was seeing. Destroy the marriage. Distract the boss. Hit the empire while he was in the middle of the wreckage of his own home. She was playing both sides, Dae-Hyun said. Yes. She built the affair because she needed personal access. And she used it because she needed me unable to focus for long enough to move assets. That's what I believe, yes. Dae-Hyun stood up from the hotel chair and walked to the window. The city was dark below him, the particular compressed darkness of a city that never fully sleeps, just breathes differently after midnight. It was still my choice, he said. Dae-Hyun. She didn't make me betray my wife. She took something I was already willing to do and built a structure around it. His voice was level, not defensive. Something had left him, some reflex towards self-justification that he'd carried so long he hadn't known it was there until it was gone. Sora exploited my betrayal. She didn't create it. Elias was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? Everything, Dae-Hyun said. Victor Han had made 43 calls to an encrypted number over the previous 5 months. Elias had the calls. He had the duration. He had the $600,000 movement through a shell account in Delaware that corresponded almost to the day with the first confirmed access of Quan Meridian's restricted shipping documents. He brought it all to Dae-Hyun in a folder, in person, on a Wednesday afternoon. Dae-Hyun read through it without expression. He turned each page the same careful way. He turned every page, as if whatever he found on the other side, he was prepared for it. When he finished, he set the folder on the table and sat for a long moment. He was at my son's christening, Dae-Hyun said. It was the only personal thing he said. He didn't explain it. He didn't need to. Yes, Elias said. What does the rival network think their timeline is? Based on the communications, they expect to be able to move on the carrier contracts within the next 3 weeks. They're counting on continued operational disruption here. Elias cleared his throat carefully. They've been counting on you being elsewhere. Dae-Hyun stood up. Then we move first, he said, but not the way they expect us to. Elias looked at him. What does that mean? It means I'm done, Dae-Hyun said, doing things the way they've always been done. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the hotel room until 4 in the morning thinking about the shape of his life. Not business decisions, those were clear. The path was clear. He could see it, but the larger architecture. The structure underneath everything he had built. He had taken over Quan Meridian when he was 26, when his father had a stroke that left him unable to speak, and the organization had needed a head. The legitimate side of the business logistics, carriers, port operations had been there, but it was thin cover over something much older and considerably darker. He had spent the intervening years thickening the cover, making the legitimate knots genuinely profitable, pulling them far enough from the structure beneath that he could look at them without embarrassment in the daylight. He had told himself it was progress. He had told himself 100 times that he was moving toward something. Transitioning, that there was a version of Quan Meridian that would one day exist entirely in the light. He had also told himself that Amara was happy, and that the grand piano in the living room was a gift she loved, and that the woman he had married was still present, inside the one who attended his business dinners and smiled at the right moments and had stopped playing music somewhere along the way. He had been telling himself a lot of stories. He was good at it. It was in some ways the skill that had kept him alive. He picked up his phone at 4:15. He looked at the number he had been given 3 months ago by a federal investigator named Colton, who had approached him at a parking structure in Midtown and left a card with one number on it and said, simply, "When you're ready." Dae-Hyun had kept the card because he was not a man who discarded information. He was ready. He dialed the number. Amara didn't know about any of it. She was asleep on Tessa's pull-out couch, the middle bar having found her spine at precisely 2:50 a.m. As predicted, her grandmother's bracelet on her wrist, her composition notebooks, on the coffee table beside her. She had written 40 new bars that evening, the most she had written in a single sitting in years. In 4 weeks, she had become, without trying to, the person she had been before she let herself be erased. Not the same person. That woman was gone, and honestly, Amara wasn't certain she'd want her back. That woman had been too trusting and too willing to make herself small in the name of keeping a man comfortable. But the woman who had come out the other side, the woman sitting in a Brooklyn apartment in borrowed pajamas with ink on her fingers and calluses returning to her fingertips, that woman had a ferocity that the previous version had never needed to develop. She turned onto her back and stared at the ceiling. She thought about Dae-Hyun, the way she sometimes did when the apartment was quiet. Not with hatred required a sustained emotional energy she was unwilling to spend on him. Something quieter, something that was still working itself out. She thought about the robe, the cup, the knot. She thought about all the things she had packed and all the things she had left behind. She thought about 37 diamonds she hadn't touched. Then she turned onto her side, pulled the blanket up, and went back to sleep. She had teaching in the morning. She had a student who was this close to finally understanding how to let a chord breathe. She wasn't going to be tired for that. The city hummed outside the rattling window, and Amara Vance, not Mrs. Juan, not the Mafia Boss's wife, not the woman who had disappeared into someone else's life for 9 years, closed her eyes and let Brooklyn hold her while she slept. She had no idea that somewhere across the city, her husband was making a phone call that would dismantle everything he had built. She had no idea that in 3 weeks, a video of her playing would change the rest of her life. And she had no idea that the most important music she would ever write was already taking shape in her hands, note by note, in the hours she spent at a battered upright piano while the rest of the world slept. All she knew was this: she had walked out of that house with a suitcase and her grandmother's bracelet and 3 dusty notebooks. And for the first time in 9 years, she had everything she needed. The video lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. It had been shot on a phone. You could tell by the slight shake in the frame, the way whoever was holding it had tried to stay still and failed, because their hands were trembling. The audio wasn't clean. There was a heating vent somewhere off camera that clicked every 40 seconds, and at one point, a door opened and closed in the distance. And none of it mattered because what the microphone was capturing made everything else disappear. Amara didn't know it existed until Tessa dropped her phone on the kitchen table at 6:50 in the morning and said, "You need to see this right now." Amara was eating toast. She had developed a habit in the weeks since Brooklyn of eating toast standing up at the kitchen counter before school. It was such a small, ordinary thing, making her own toast, standing in her own borrowed space, eating it before anyone needed anything from her, that she had come to protect it fiercely. She looked at the phone. What is it? Just watch it. She watched it. The video had been filmed through the narrow window of the practice room door at the Brooklyn Center for Music Arts. Someone she would later learn. It was a 20-year-old volunteer named Danny, who worked the front desk on Tuesday evenings, had heard something after the last student left, and had pressed their phone to the glass and held it there, barely breathing, for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. On screen, Amara sat at the room for upright, with her back to the door. She couldn't see herself playing. She could only hear what she had played that evening, 3 days ago, the 40-something bars she'd written, the thing that was growing into something she didn't have a name for, yet coming back to her through in a Brooklyn kitchen. And it landed differently when you were outside of it, when you weren't the one making it. She watched herself play for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. She set the phone down. Someone filmed me, she said. Danny posted it last night. It has 200,000 views. Tessa sat down across from her. Amara. That was 6 hours ago. It has 200,000 views. Amara looked at the toast in her hand. She should have asked me, she said. I know. She stopped. That was private. That was something I was working out in private. I know. I know it was. And we can be angry about that. And you have every right. Tessa leaned forward. But I need you to understand what you're looking at. This isn't a cute viral video. People aren't sharing it because it's interesting. They're sharing it because it did something to them. She paused. It did something to me, and I've known you for 17 years. Amara looked at the phone again. She didn't watch it a second time. She didn't need to. She knew what was on it. She had been there. I have class at 8, she said. Amara, I have class at 8, Tessa. I have Frederick at 8 and Precious at 9, and I am not going to cancel on them because someone filmed me without asking. She put the toast down, picked up her bag, and went to work. By the time she arrived at the center, the video had 400,000 views. Danny was waiting in the hallway outside room 4, visibly braced for impact, her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes already apologetic. She was 20 years old and earnest, and she had the look of someone who had spent the night realizing what she'd done. No, Miss, she stopped. Miss Vance, I'm so sorry, I should have asked. I heard it, and I didn't want to stop it, and then I posted it without thinking, and I know that was wrong. It was wrong, Amara said. I know. That room is where I work out things that aren't ready yet. That's not a performance space. I know. I'm sorry. I'll take it down right now if you want. Amara thought about it. The thing was already out there. Taking it down now would be closing a door after the house had burned. And there was something else. Something she didn't want to examine too closely yet. A complicated feeling that sat underneath the genuine anger. Something that felt uncomfortably like being heard. Leave it, she said. Danny blinked. Really? Leave it. But if you ever film me without asking again, you won't get a third word out of me. She looked at her steadily. Are we clear? Yes, absolutely. Frederick's going to be here in 10 minutes. Can you let him know I'll be in room 2 today? She walked past her toward the back of the building. The B-flat in room 4 is stuck again. Frederick arrived at 8 with a thermos of coffee he always brought for himself and had started, around week 3, also bringing a second cup for Amara without comment. He set it on top of the piano without saying anything about it, and Amara had started up to, without saying anything, and that was the arrangement they had settled into. He sat down on the bench, placed his hands in position. He was working on basic chord progressions. Still, but his hands had started to feel less foreign to him in the past 2 weeks, and Amara could see the shift. I saw a video of you this morning, he said. She looked at him. My granddaughter sent it to me. She's 23. She said, Grandpa, isn't that your piano teacher? He looked down at the keys. I told her yes, and she said, she's incredible. Why is she teaching beginner piano in Brooklyn? What did you tell her? Frederick smiled at the keyboard. I said that's where I am, so that's where she needs to be. Amara sat in her chair. She pressed her mouth flat against something that was going to embarrass her if she let it out. Play your G chord, she said. He played it. Better than last week. The third was clean. Again, she said. He played it again. That's better, she said. Much better. Your hand is relaxing. I practice every evening now, he said, after dinner. Before the news. My daughter thinks I've lost my mind. Your daughter is wrong. That's what I told her. He played the G chord a third time, unprompted. She said, and I want you to know I told her she was being unkind. She said, Dad, you're 68. Why are you starting something new? He paused. I told her it's precisely because I'm 68. Amara looked at this man retired, widowed, 68 years old. Sitting at a piano he couldn't play yet, because he had made a promise to a woman he could no longer speak to, and she thought about the 4 minutes and 11 seconds of music she hadn't meant to share with anyone. Maybe, she thought, that was the point of it. Maybe the thing you make in the dark, alone, when you're working out the worst of what happened to you. Maybe that's exactly the thing that finds other people in the dark. She didn't say any of that to Frederick. G to C, she said instead. Nice and slow. The video crossed 1 million views at 11:14 that morning while Amara was eating a sandwich in the break room. Tessa texted her a screenshot. Amara stared at the number for a long moment. Then she put her phone face down on the table and finished her sandwich. It was halfway through her afternoon session with a 12-year-old named Jonah who was technically gifted and emotionally resistant to any piece that didn't have a recognizable video game connection, when the center's director, a harried woman named Patricia, knocked on the door and leaned in with an expression that suggested something had complicated her afternoon significantly. There's a journalist from the Times in the lobby, Patricia said, and someone on the phone who says he's calling from a record label in Los Angeles. And your phone has been ringing at the front desk because apparently someone found our number. She looked at Amara with the combined expression of apology and fascination. I don't know what's happening. I do, Amara said. Tell the journalist I'm not available. Tell Los Angeles I don't have a record label relationship and I'm in a session. They said they'd call back. That's fine. Patricia hovered. Is there anything I should? Jonah, Amara said, turning back to the 12-year-old who was watching all of this with open interest. Hands on the keys. Jonah put his hands on the keys. Patricia retreated. The calls kept coming. By the end of the week, there were 3. By the following Monday, there were 11, from producers, journalists, podcast hosts, a streaming platform's content team, a woman who claimed to represent a luxury brand and wanted Amara to be in a commercial. Amara ignored all of them. Tessa fielded a few, not because Amara had asked her to, but because Tessa had strong opinions about people who called repeatedly, and she expressed those opinions directly and without apology. You need representation, Tessa said, on Wednesday evening. You need someone between you and all of this. I don't want someone between me and all of this. I want to teach my students and finish my compositions. Those two things are not mutually exclusive with being paid appropriately. Amara looked at her. I'm serious, Tessa said. I know you have money. I know the settlement is. I haven't touched the settlement. Tessa stopped. At all? Not $1, Amara. I'm not spending his money. He doesn't have a say in whether you spend it. You were married for 9 years, and I know what he did. Her voice was flat. I know exactly what I'm entitled to. I also know that every time I would spend that money, I would think about where it came from and what I gave up to be in the position to receive it. And I don't want that. She paused. I'm fine. The teaching pays enough. Don't need.
You're sleeping on a pull-out couch with a bar that attacks your spine.
I'm looking at apartments. With what? A beat. With my teaching salary, Amara said, with a dignity that was slightly undercut by the circumstances. Tessa rubbed her face with both hands. Just talk to Malcolm Reeves. Who? He called again today. He's a producer, Los Angeles, but he works out of New York a lot. He's not a label guy in the way you're imagining. He's been in the industry for 20 years. He does serious work with serious artists. And he specifically said, she pulled out her phone and read from a note. He said, tell her I'm not interested in what she can give me. I'm interested in what she needs to finish what she's already started. Amara was quiet. One conversation, Tessa said. Coffee. Public place. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. When did you become my manager? Someone has to be. Tessa put her phone down. You've been given something rare, Amara. You were given your voice back. Not everyone who loses it gets it back. And I will not sit here and watch you bury it again, because you don't want to be inconvenienced by the attention it deserves. The apartment was quiet. The heating pipes clicked. One conversation, Amara said. Across the city, in a federal building in Lower Manhattan, Dae-Hyun Kwon sat across a conference table from two investigators and a woman named Sandra Park, who served as his attorney. Table was standard government issue, the kind that had no warmth in it, and the fluorescent lights above were the kind that made everyone look slightly unwell. Dae-Hyun had been in many rooms more threatening than this one. He had sat across from men who intended to cause him physical harm and held eye contact without blinking. He was not afraid of this room. He was, however, acutely aware of what he was doing in it. The investigator who spoke most was a man named Colton, the same man who had left a card at a parking structure in Midtown. He was methodical and precise, and he asked his questions in a particular order that Dae-Hyun recognized as strategic, starting with logistics data, moving to financial structures, working gradually toward the names. He wanted a picture before he asked about the people in it. We need the shell structure, Colton said. All of it. Not just what touches the port operation. Everything. Everything touches the port operation eventually, Dae-Hyun said. Then everything. Sandra put her hand on Dae-Hyun's arm briefly, a professional gesture, a reminder. He acknowledged it and looked back at Colton. You understand what you're asking for, Dae-Hyun said. I understand exactly what I'm asking for. You're asking me to give you the whole architecture. Not just Victor Hahn's network. The whole structure that Quan Meridian was built on top of. Yes, that includes people who have had nothing to do with this conspiracy. People who have been operating legitimately for years. Some of them, yes, they'll be caught in the investigation regardless. Some of them, Colton said again, without apology, yes. Dae-Hyun was quiet for a moment. Across the table, Colton waited with the patience of someone who had learned that silence was a tool and that using it required not filling it. My cousin Dae-Hyun said, Elias, Kwon, he brought me the information that got us to this room. His exposure in this needs to be managed. Mr. Kwon cooperated proactively. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm telling you what I need in order to proceed. Elias's exposure is managed, and the individuals in the legitimate operations who have no connection to the criminal structure receive time to restructure before you move. He looked at Colton steadily. Everything else, you get everything. Colton exchanged a glance with the other investigator, a younger woman who had said very little but had been writing steadily in a legal pad since they sat down. We can discuss parameters, Colton said. I'm not discussing parameters. I'm stating conditions. The silence this time lasted longer. We'll discuss conditions, Colton said. Elias received the call at 10 that evening. He was in his car, still in the parking structure of the Quan Meridian offices, because he had stopped there an hour ago and had not been able to make himself drive away. He had been sitting in the dark with the engine off, thinking about the folder he had put on the conference table that afternoon, the one with Victor's communications, the shell accounts, the coordinates of a network that had been built inside Dae-Hyun's trust over 11 years. He had built the case. He had handed it over. He had done the right thing. He was not sure why doing the right thing felt so much like grief. When his phone rang and he saw Dae-Hyun's number, he answered on the second ring. Tell me, Elias said. I had the meeting, and it's going to happen. We're moving forward. A pause. I wanted you to hear it from me, not through the organization. From me. Elias stared through the windshield at the concrete pillar directly in front of his car. You're giving them everything. Yes, Dae-Hyun. Do you understand what the organization looks like on the other side of this? It doesn't look like anything. It's gone. Elias absorbed that. The legitimate operations. Stay, restructure, clean. Dae-Hyun's voice was even, the way it got when he had already made peace with a decision, and was now simply transmitting it. That was always the destination. We're just arriving faster than planned. Because you got played. Because I betrayed my wife, and someone built a conspiracy on top of my betrayal. Yes, no defensiveness, just the words laid flat. How's the East Coast operation? Elias recognized the subject change for what it was. He let it go. Victor hasn't moved yet. He's waiting. I think he's waiting for more chaos from your side. He expected a war response. He expected you to go kinetic and drag attention away from the financial channels. He doesn't know me as well as he thinks he does. Apparently not. Elias paused. What do you want me to do with him in the meantime? Nothing. Don't touch him. Don't spook him. I need him exactly where he is when Colton's team is ready to move. A brief silence. And Elias, the inside contact Victor has at the Port Authority, find them. Before this goes public, I want to know exactly how exposed that channel is. I can have that in 48 hours. Good. Elias leaned his head back against the headrest. Dae-Hyun. What? It was not quite a question. More of an opening. Are you okay? A long pause. The kind that from Dae-Hyun meant something. No, he said, but I'm doing the right things anyway. Another pause. That's going to have to be enough for now. The call ended. Elias sat in the dark parking structure for another 20 minutes. Then he started his car and drove. Malcolm Reeves was not what Amara had expected. She had constructed, without realizing she was doing it, an image of him that involved a certain type, polished, performatively casual. Someone whose respect for artists was real but ultimately subordinate to his interest in what those artists could produce. She had met men like that throughout her career before her marriage. She knew how to read them in the first 5 minutes and how to protect herself accordingly. Malcolm was 54, wore a jacket that had seen better days, and arrived at the coffee shop on Dean Street 3 minutes late with the slightly harassed energy of someone who had been on the subway, which she had not expected from a Los Angeles producer. He sat down across from her, flagged down the server without looking at the menu, ordered a black coffee, and then looked at her directly. I'm going to be straight with you, he said, because I think you've probably had a month of people who weren't. Go ahead. That video wrecked me. I don't say that to compliment you. I'm saying it as a data point because it tells you something about what the material is. I've been doing this 22 years. I've sat across from extraordinary musicians. That video is not extraordinary musician playing beautifully. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. That's extraordinary musician, having the worst and the most real conversation of their life, and happened to be using a piano to have it. That's different. That hits people differently. Amara looked at him. You flew from Los Angeles for a 4-minute video. I was already in New York. But yes, also yes, he met her eyes. Tell me about the compositions. How much do you have? That's a fairly direct opening. You've been fielding calls for 2 weeks. You don't need small talk. You need someone who's actually listening. He shrugged. Tell me about the compositions. Fiends, she looked at him for a moment longer. Then she picked up her coffee. I have 43 completed bars of the piece in the video. I have 3 other pieces in various states. 1 is essentially done. 2 are in fragments. And I have a 4th piece that I've been calling the knot in my notebooks because I don't have a better name for it yet. And it's the one I can't finish because I haven't decided what the ending should sound like. What are the options for the ending? Forgiveness or survival? She paused. They sound different. Malcolm was quiet for a moment. Which one is honest? I don't know yet. Good. She frowned slightly. Why is that good? Because if you knew, you'd have finished it already. The fact that you don't know means the piece is still ahead of you. That's the best place to be. He put down his cup. I want to help you make an album. Not produce an album, help you make one. Your compositions, your terms, your decisions. I'm a resource. I'm ears and I'm industry knowledge, and I'm someone who will fight like a dog for you to maintain creative control. And in exchange, I get to be in the room while you figure out what the ending of the knot sounds like. He paused. That's what I'm offering. That's the whole thing. Amara studied him. Why? She said. Because every few years something like this comes along, and I want to be attached to the real version of it, not the polished commercial version. He was matter-of-fact about it. Also, honestly, because I played my daughter the video, and she cried for 10 minutes and then called me 3 times that day to make sure I'd reached out to you. How old is your daughter? 31. She's a doctor. Extremely practical, very difficult to move emotionally. He smiled slightly. You moved her. That matters to me personally. Amara set her cup down. I have conditions, she said. I expected you to. The teaching doesn't stop. I keep my schedule at the center. Fine. The album is called what I decide to call it. Obviously. No press until I have something I'm willing to stand behind. No previews, no teasers, no social content built around the process. What happened with that video, I understand. It worked in a certain way, but I want the control back. Malcolm nodded slowly. That's harder. Not impossible, but harder. People are looking for you. The press is going to find the thread eventually. Then let them find it when I'm ready. Okay. He looked at her steadily. What else? She hesitated. Just for a moment, a fraction of a pause that she would have smoothed over a year ago, would have apologized for, would have redirected into something more palatable. If I decide the ending of the knot is survival, and not forgiveness, she said, I need that to be the ending. Malcolm held her gaze. That's the ending. She extended her hand. He shook it. Victor Hahn found out on a Thursday. He didn't find out about the federal investigation, not yet. He found out that Sora's access to the shipping documents had been flagged. It was one step before finding out about the investigation, and that one step was already enough to make the blood drain from his face, in a way his assistant noticed and mentioned to no one. He called the encrypted number from the parking structure of a restaurant in Flushing. The man who answered went by a name Victor had never been able to verify. He spoke with a flatness that had always unnerved Victor, a particular quality of voice that suggested no conversation was important enough to perform emotion for. It's flagged, Victor said. We know. Victor's hand tightened around the phone. You knew before I did? We have channels you don't have access to. Then why didn't you tell me? Because it didn't change the timeline. It changes everything, Victor said. The parking structure was cold and smelled of exhaust, and his breath was coming faster than he wanted it to. If Elias traced the credentials, then Dae-Hyun knows. If Dae-Hyun knows about Sora, he knows she had access to more than she was authorized for. He's going to trace it. He's going to trace it back. He's already traced it back to you. The silence after those words lasted a long time. How long? Victor asked. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Victor said the words slowly. You've known for 2 weeks that Dae-Hyun Kwon knows my name, and you did not tell me. We needed you in position. In position. His voice went very flat. As bait. As the visible layer of the operation. Yes. Victor looked at the concrete ceiling of the parking structure. He had worked for Dae-Hyun Kwon for 11 years. He had been at his son's christening. He had watched this man operate for over a decade, and he understood, in the particular way you understand something you have watched happen to other people, exactly what it meant when Dae-Hyun Kwon knew your name and had known it for 2 weeks and had not yet moved. He was not moving because he was not going to move the way Victor expected him to. What is he doing? Victor asked. We're not certain. You have channels I don't have access to, but you're not certain what Dae-Hyun Kwon has been doing for 2 weeks, since he identified me as the inside threat. There's been activity on his end that doesn't follow predictable patterns. He hasn't moved any assets. He hasn't mobilized his security. He hasn't contacted any of his usual. He's talking to the feds, Victor said. Pause from the other end. It's exactly that. Victor pushed off the wall he'd been leaning against. He's not retaliating because he's not going to retaliate. He's doing something I didn't account for because I didn't think he was capable of it. He pressed his hand flat against the cold concrete. I built this whole structure on the assumption that Dae-Hyun Kwon would respond to a threat with force. I spent 8 months moving pieces into position around that assumption. He breathed out. He's changing. He's not going to... He's changing, Victor said again, as if saying it a second time might make the person on the other end of the line understand what that meant. His wife left him. She walked out and he let her go, and that's not the man I built this plan around. That man would have brought her home. That man would have locked down every exit and demanded control of every variable. That man does not let someone he loves walk out of his house. His voice had dropped. She left, and he let her go, and now he's talking to the feds instead of going to war, and I have 8 months of positioning. That is completely useless if he won't behave the way I need him to behave. The silence from the other end was the kind that preceded a recalibration. We need to accelerate the timeline, the man finally said. How far? The carrier contracts. We move on them now, before he can secure the channel with the investigators. Before whatever he's handing them reaches the right desk. If we move now, we expose the Port Authority connection. The Port Authority connection is already compromised. We cut it and move. Victor looked at the phone, at the encrypted number on the screen. He thought about 11 years of working for a man he had genuinely respected, and about the moment he could trace it. He could find the exact evening when he had decided that respect was not going to be enough. He thought about Dae-Hyun Kwan, sitting in a federal building in Lower Manhattan, handing over the architecture of his entire empire, and he thought, when did you become someone who does that? And then, when did I become someone who needed you not to? If we move now, Victor said carefully, and he's already cooperating, if the timeline overlaps. Then we move fast enough that it doesn't matter. Victor closed his eyes. He thought about his daughter, who was 14, and was learning to play piano because her school had a music program, and she had fallen into it naturally and called him one evening last month to play a few bars of something over the phone, and he had stood in this same parking structure, listening to the tinny recording of his kid playing piano, and thought, this is what I'm doing all of this for. Then he thought about Amara Vance, who had apparently been playing piano in a Brooklyn practice room at midnight and breaking people's hearts with it, and about the way Dae-Hyun had described her once, years ago. In a moment of unusual openness, she could have been extraordinary. She was extraordinary before. Victor opened his eyes. Give me 48 hours, he said. You have 24. The call ended. Victor stood in the parking structure alone. He had 24 hours before the move that would either complete 8 months of work or blow up in his face, with a federal investigation already in motion on the other side. He had built this entire plan on knowing who Dae-Hyun Kwan was. And Dae-Hyun Kwan had become someone else. He walked back to his car, started the engine, sat with his hands on the wheel for a moment without driving. Then he pulled out his personal phone, not the encrypted one, and he did something he had not done in 8 months of careful operational security. He called his daughter. She answered on the third ring, sleepy. It was nearly 11. Dad? Hey, sweetheart. His voice came out wrong. He heard it and couldn't fix it. A pause. Dad, are you okay? Yeah, he said. I just wanted to hear your voice. Another pause. 14-year-olds were perceptive, in ways that were sometimes inconvenient. You sound weird. Go back to sleep. Are you sure you're... Go to sleep, baby. I love you too, she said, uncertain. He hung up. He sat in the cold car in the parking structure and looked at his own reflection in the dark windshield and understood, with the particular clarity that comes too late, there was no version of the next 24 hours that brought him out the other side, intact. He had committed too much, taken too many steps in one direction. There was no road back. He put the car in reverse and drove toward the only ending he had left. Victor Hahn made 3 calls in the 20 minutes as it took him to drive from Flushing back toward Manhattan. The first call was to a man named Bae, who managed the physical documentation for the shell, accounts a quiet, careful man who had been handling paperwork for the network for 4 years and who understood, without needing it explained, that when Victor called at 11:15 on a Thursday night, the word now meant exactly that. The second call was to a port official named Greer, who had been taking payments through a real estate LLC in New Jersey for 16 months. Greer did not answer. Victor left no message. The fact that Greer didn't answer at 11:15 on a Thursday night, when Greer always answered because Greer was afraid not to answer, told Victor something he did not want to know. The third call went to the encrypted number. It rang 7 times and went to nothing. Not voicemail, nothing. Victor set his phone on the passenger seat and drove the rest of the way in silence. He parked 2 blocks from the Quan Meridian offices on Varick Street, not the main entrance. The service entrance in the back, the one he had a key for because he had always been trusted, because he had spent 11 years making himself indispensable and trustworthy and present, and now those 11 years had a different shape when he looked at them. The building was dark at this hour, except for the fourth floor, where the security desk ran overnight. Victor had signed in and out of this building hundreds of times. He knew the overnight guard, a man named Terrence, who always had a crossword going and who would nod at Victor without breaking his pen from the page. Victor took the stairs instead of the elevator. He needed to retrieve 3 things from his office: a hard drive, a folder of physical documents that he had kept foolishly, he now understood, sentimentally and foolishly, in the locked bottom drawer of his desk, rather than in an off-site location. And a phone, a second phone, that he had left in the back of the same drawer 6 weeks ago, when the paranoia of keeping it on his person had outweighed the inconvenience of leaving it behind. He reached the 6th floor, pushed through the stairwell door. His office was at the end of the hall. Elias Kwan was sitting in the chair in front of Victor's desk, in the dark, waiting. Victor stopped in the doorway. He and Elias looked at each other across the office. Elias was still in his suit from the day. He looked like a man who had not moved from that chair in some time. On the desk in front of him, visible even in the dark, from the ambient light of the city through the window, were 3 items: the hard drive, the folder, and the second phone. The locked bottom drawer was open. Victor's hand was still on the door frame. "Sit down, Victor," Elias said. His voice was entirely level. No heat in it. That was the thing about Elias that had always unsettled Victor slightly. He didn't perform emotion. He was not like Dae-Hyun, who had a stillness that read as power. Elias had a quiet that read as something colder than power. Competence, maybe. Or just the particular calm of a man who had already decided what he was going to do before he sat down to wait. "How long have you been here?" Victor asked. "Since 8. 3 hours. Victor had been driving around, flushing, and making phone calls whilst Elias sat in his office in the dark for 3 hours. I have the combination to every locked drawer in this building," Elias said. "You knew that when you worked here." Victor let go of the doorframe. He walked into his office, and he sat down in his own chair behind his own desk, and he looked at the 3 items Elias had placed in front of him. "Is Dae-Hyun here?" Victor asked. "No. Does he know you're here?" "He knows everything I know." Elias picked up the second phone between 2 fingers, looked at it briefly, then set it back down. "Victor, I've known you for 9 years. I want you to understand that what I'm about to ask you is not a formality. I genuinely need to understand." Victor said nothing. "Why Victor Han?" Elias asked. "Specifically, not the network. I understand the network. I understand what they wanted and what they offered. I mean you specifically. You were the inside channel. You didn't have to be. Someone in that network chose to approach you, and you said yes. I want to understand what the conversation looked like." Victor looked at the hard drive on his desk. "How much do you already know?" he said. "Enough that your answer is going to tell me whether you're thinking about lying to me or not." A long moment. "They came to me 18 months ago," Victor said. "Not with an offer, with information. They showed me they had documentation of 3 separate incidents where Quan Meridian's criminal structure had been used to move product through our port operations without my knowledge or authorization. My name was on the carrier contracts. My signature was on the documentation." He paused. "I had no knowledge of it. I want you to understand that I had no knowledge of it happening, and my signature was on those documents." Elias was completely still. "Forged," he said. "Forged. Very well forged." Victor's jaw was tight. "They told me that if I didn't cooperate with them, those documents would find their way to federal investigators, and I would be charged for operations I never authorized and never knew about." He looked at Elias. "I have a 14-year-old daughter. I know. They knew exactly which lever to pull. They always do." Elias's voice was unchanged. "Why didn't you come to Dae-Hyun?" The question hit Victor somewhere he hadn't fully braced for. He absorbed it. "Because I didn't know if the documents were authorized by him. I didn't know whether to trust that he didn't know. And I'd been with this organization long enough to understand that there are layers of what happens here that I'm not privy to, and I couldn't." He stopped. "I was afraid of Dae-Hyun, of being wrong about Dae-Hyun." Victor's voice was low. "There's a difference. I wasn't afraid he would hurt me if I went to him innocent. I was afraid he would confirm that I was never as safe here as I thought I was. Elias sat with that for a moment. He leaned forward and placed both forearms on the desk. So you cooperated, he said. You gave them access to the shipping schedules. At first, yes. What they asked for was limited. Scheduling information. Carrier windows. He pressed his fingers together. It expanded. Every request expanded into the next one. By the time I understood the full scope of what they were building, I was already inside it. And Sora, I didn't recruit Sora. She was already their asset when they brought me in. She was placed in Dae-Hyun's office 14 months before they approached me. I didn't know that until month 4. Victor's eyes moved to the window. When I found out she had been positioned specifically to compromise Dae-Hyun personally, that was when I understood I wasn't a partner in this. I was another piece being moved around a board. Elias was quiet. They used your fear, Elias said finally, of prosecution, of Dae-Hyun, of losing what you'd built. They forged documents to create leverage, then walked you into a position where you were generating real leverage they could use. He paused. The original documents, the forged ones. Do you have copies? Victor opened his mouth, closed it. Victor, they're not here. They're in a safety deposit box in a bank in Midtown. Which bank? Victor told him. Elias stood up. He picked up the hard drive, the folder, and the second phone and held them in 2 hands, managing it without effort, as if he had expected to be carrying them out of here. We're going to need those documents, Elias said. If what you're telling me about the original leverage is accurate, it changes the shape of what you're facing legally. That's not a promise. I'm not your lawyer, and this is not a negotiation. But it changes the shape. What happens now? Victor asked. Now you don't make any more calls on any device in this building. Elias walked to the door, stopped. Victor, the call you made to your daughter tonight. From your personal phone around 11:30. Victor went very still. She sounded worried about you, Elias said. Not cruelly. Just plainly. You should be the person she doesn't have reason to worry about. He walked out. Victor sat alone in his dark office and listened to the sound of Elias's footsteps receding down the hallway. Then he put both hands flat on his desk and pressed down hard, like he was trying to push through it, and closed his eyes. Dae-Hyun received the call from Elias at midnight. He was at the hotel, in the chair by the window that had become his chair over, the past weeks the one that faced east, toward a slice of the East River visible between 2 buildings if you angled right. He had developed, without intending to, a habit of sitting there in the evenings after midnight when sleep wouldn't come and thinking about things he had previously been too busy or too armored to sit with. Tonight, he had been thinking about the letter he was going to write. Not planning it, he wasn't a man who drafted things mentally before committing them to paper, but feeling around the edges of it, what it needed to contain, what it couldn't leave out in the name of self-protection. When Elias called, he answered immediately. Victor was at the office, Elias said. I know. Terrence called me when Victor signed in. Pause. You let him go in. I needed to know what he was going in for. And I needed him to have the conversation with you, rather than with me. A brief silence. What did he say? Elias relayed it, with precision, in the particular way he reported things linear, no editorializing, letting the facts construct the picture without commentary. When he finished, the line was quiet. The forged documents, Dae-Hyun said. If they exist the way he says they do, someone inside our structure, or someone with access to our documentation, created leverage against one of our own people using our own materials. That's not the rival network acting alone. That requires an inside hand. Dae-Hyun stared at the slice of river. Someone who had access to shipping documentation and signature files, he said. Yes, and who would benefit from Victor being compromised and controllable. Yes. How far back do Victor's forged documents trace? He says 18 months. Elias paused, which means the forgeries were created approximately 2 months before Sora Min joined the company. The silence this time lasted longer. Dae-Hyun stood up from the chair. He walked to the window and stood close to the glass, his forehead nearly touching it, looking at the dark city. She was placed inside the company, he said. And before she was placed, someone inside the company helped build the leverage that would bring Victor in line. They needed Victor controllable before they could use him. His voice was even but very quiet. She didn't get placed because of the affair. The affair came after. She built the affair. To complete the picture, Elias said, "Control Victor with documents. Control me through Sora. Control the port operations through both channels simultaneously." He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. Find the inside hand. Whoever created those forgeries had access to documentation that requires a high clearance level. That's a short list. I have the list, Elias said. There are 7 names on it. Get me the one that doesn't fit. How do I identify that? The one who changed something about their behavior, approximately 20 months ago. Spending pattern, communication pattern, something. Everyone on that list has been with us long enough to have a baseline. He moved away from the window. 20 months ago, someone made a decision. Find the moment they made it. That's going to take. I know how long it's going to take. Start tonight, another pause. Dae-Hyun, the federal timeline. I know. If they move before you identify the inside person. Then we hand Colton an incomplete picture, and incomplete pictures have gaps that get filled in ways we can't control. He picked up his jacket from the back of the desk chair. I'm going to the office. It's midnight, I'm aware. He arrived at 12:20. The building was the particular kind of quiet that large offices get after hours, not empty, exactly, because there was always a skeleton presence, but hollowed out. The ambient noise of occupation removed and replaced with something that was almost like the building breathing. He took the elevator to the executive floor, unlocked his office, did not turn on the overhead lights, just the desk lamp, which threw a narrow pool of yellow across the surface. He sat down and opened his laptop and pulled up the access logs for the documentation system. Elias had sent him the short list, 7 names. He read them twice. Then he started going backward through the logs, month by month, looking for the access pattern that didn't belong. It was slow work, and it required the particular patience. He had the patience of a man who had learned early that the detail that broke something open was almost never the obvious one. He had been at it for 40 minutes when the thing he found stopped him cold. Not a person on the list. A ghost access, a credential that had been deactivated 18 months ago. A former logistics coordinator who had left the company voluntarily, whose departure had been unremarkable enough that Dae-Hyun had signed the exit paperwork without a second thought. The deactivated credential had been used to access the shipping documentation files. 22 months ago, a single access, 3 minutes long, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. Dae-Hyun stared at the screen. The credential belonged to a woman named Ji-Young Park, who had worked in the logistics division for 2 years and had left for a position in Seattle. Her file was clean. Her exit interview was positive. There was nothing in her record that triggered anything. But a deactivated credential doesn't reactivate itself. Someone with administrator-level access had temporarily reactivated it, not assigned it, not transferred it, temporarily and quietly brought it back to life for 3 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon, used it to access the shipping documentation, and deactivated it again. He pulled the administrator log for that timestamp. There was no administrator action logged at that time, which meant the log had been edited, which meant whoever had done this had access not just to the documentation system, but to the audit trail itself. There were 3 people with that level of system access. Himself, Elias, and the head of Quan Meridian's internal IT security, a man named James Cho, who had been with the company for 14 years and who had built the security architecture of their digital systems from the ground up. Dae-Hyun sat very still in the lamplight. He picked up his phone and called Elias. James Cho, he said when Elias picked up, a silence that lasted 3 full seconds. From Elias, 3 seconds was a lifetime. Say that again, Elias said. James Cho, 14 years. He built the system. He knows every back door in it because he installed them. Dae-Hyun's voice was completely flat. He reactivated a ghost credential 22 months ago and edited the audit log. Edit is visible if you go back through the secondary backup logs, which almost nobody knows exist. Because James built those too and didn't publicize them. How do you know about the secondary backup logs? Because I built this company, and I made James show me every failsafe he installed. A pause. Did you know? No. Elias's voice was tight. I did not know. I need you to be certain of that. Dae-Hyun. A sharp exhale. I have been with you for 21 years. I handed you the information that got us to this room. If I were James Cho, I would not have handed you the information. A beat. No, Dae-Hyun said. You wouldn't have. He stood up. Where is James tonight? I don't know. I'd have to find out. Don't contact him. Don't let him know he's been found. I need his physical location in the next 30 minutes. Okay? And Elias. He paused. If James built the documentation forgeries that were used to leverage Victor, he wasn't working alone. He was working for someone. Victor's leverage was a tool. Sora was a tool. James is a tool. He walked to the window. Someone outside the organization has been building this for close to 2 years. They had the patience to recruit a company insider and wait. That's not the rival network. They don't have that kind of patience or that kind of reach into us. He pressed one hand flat against the glass. Who benefits most from Quan Meridian's East Coast port operations being transferred to another network? Elias thought. Not long. Elias didn't need long. There are 2 networks operating on the eastern seaboard that have the infrastructure to absorb our carrier contracts. Marcus Webb's operation out of Philadelphia, or he stopped. Or, Dae-Hyun said, or Thomas Lim, Elias said quietly, out of New Jersey. The name landed in the room differently than a regular name. Thomas Lim was 63 years old and had spent 40 of those years building a logistics and freight operation that was, on paper, entirely legitimate. He had no criminal record. He donated to arts foundations and hospital wings. He had attended Dae-Hyun's father's funeral and stood with the family. He had also 23 years ago tried to buy Quan Meridian from Dae-Hyun's father during a period of financial difficulty and been refused. Dae-Hyun had been 28 years old. He remembered the refusal. He remembered his father's face when he said no. Thomas Lim has been waiting 23 years, Dae-Hyun said. He's patient, Elias said. He's pathological. The flatness in Dae-Hyun's voice deepened. He spent 2 years building a mechanism to take what my father wouldn't sell him. He recruited James from the inside, positioned Sora to compromise me personally, built leverage against Victor to control the operations from below. He paused. He was counting on me to go to war with Victor. The chaos of a war response would have given him the window to move on the carrier contracts through the legal back door. Competing claims, distracted principals, regulatory confusion. He exhaled through his nose. He was counting on me to be exactly who I used to be. He miscalculated. Yes. Dae-Hyun turned from the window. But he hasn't stopped moving. If Thomas Lim finds out that Victor's situation is compromised and that we're further along than he expected, he will not wait. He will push everything forward. Like Victor said. Accelerate the timeline. Call Colton, Dae-Hyun said. Tonight. Now. Everything changes. This isn't a rival network looking to absorb port operations. This is Thomas Lim and a 2-year operation with an inside architect. Colton needs the full picture before morning. Dae-Hyun, it's 1A. I know what time it is. Colton has a number that is answered at any hour. I have it. He picked up his jacket. Call him from your end and I'll call from mine. I want him moving before James Cho wakes up tomorrow morning. James Cho was at his apartment in Astoria. Elias had to contact a building manager who owed a quiet favor, and the confirmation came back at 1:20 A. James was home. His lights had gone off around 11. His car was in the building's lot. Dae-Hyun called Colton at 1:23. Colton answered on the second ring, which told Dae-Hyun something about the kind of man Colton was. I have a name, Dae-Hyun said. An architect. This is not Victor Han's operation. Victor was leveraged into it. The inside man is James Cho, head of internal IT security at Quan Meridian. He has been working for a man named Thomas Lim, who runs a freight operation out of New Jersey, and I can give you the audit trail that connects them if your people know where to look in the secondary backup logs of our documentation system. A pause from Colton. Thomas Lim, Colton said. You know the name. We've been aware of Thomas Lim for some time, in a general capacity. Another pause, shorter. You're telling me he's the principal. I'm telling you he's the principal. Everything else, Victor Sora, the port operation play, those are layers. He's what's underneath, Mr. Kwan. Colton's voice shifted slightly, something in it that wasn't quite urgency but was adjacent to it. If Thomas Lim is the principal, then when he realizes this investigation has reached his level, and he will realize that, possibly very soon his options narrow significantly. A man in his position with 40 years of operations to protect becomes unpredictable. I know. The people in the visible layers of this. Victor Han, Sora Min, a pause. Anyone whose involvement connects visibly to Lim's name. Dae-Hyun understood immediately what Colton was saying. Victor, he said, if Thomas Lim panics and reaches for damage control, Victor becomes a liability he needs to silence. That's a significant possibility. Yes. Dae-Hyun grabbed his keys from the desk. Where is Victor right now? We don't have surveillance on Victor Han. Put it on. He was already moving toward the door. And Colton James Cho cannot be in his office tomorrow morning. Whatever your timeline was, it ends tonight. He hung up. Called Elias in the elevator. Victor, he said the moment Elias picked up. Where did he go after you left him at the office? I assumed home. Find him, right now, and get someone physical to his location. He pushed through the lobby door into the night air. Lim is going to realize the inside track is burned. When he does, Victor is the thread that connects to him. Victor is the thread that can connect to him, which makes Victor the thread Thomas Lim is going to want cut. He moved toward where his car was parked. Call me when you have him. The city at 1:30 in the morning had a particular texture. The streets were not empty, but they were sparse. The gaps between people and vehicles wide enough that the city showed its bones. Dae-Hyun stood on the sidewalk and waited for his driver. And he looked at those bones, the architecture, underneath the surface of a city that had always looked to him like permanence, and understood that permanence was something you told yourself when you couldn't face how temporary everything actually was. His phone lit up. Elias. Victor's not at his apartment, Elias said. Dae-Hyun's hand tightened on the phone. Building's locked? Building manager let me in. His apartment is empty. His car is not in the garage. A brief pause. Dae-Hyun. His phone is going to voicemail. Track the car. Working on it. The driver pulled up. Dae-Hyun got in. Where are we going? The driver asked. Dae-Hyun stared through the windshield. Victor Han, 11 years with the company, a man at his son's christening, a man whose loyalty had seemed concrete and then had turned out to be corroded from the inside by a fear he'd never shared with anyone who could have helped him carry it. Victor was driving somewhere at 1:30 in the morning with his phone off and no one who knew where he was. And Thomas Lim's people, somewhere in this city, were deciding what they could and couldn't afford to leave alive. Keep driving, Dae-Hyun said. I'll tell you when I have an address. He looked at his own reflection in the dark window. The man looking back at him had the face of someone who had spent 25 years being exactly one kind of person and had spent the last 6 weeks trying to understand what came next. He had told Colton he was ready to hand over the architecture of everything he had built. He had meant it, but meaning something and having the ground hold steady under your feet while you did it were, it turned out, two very different things. His phone lit up again. Got the car, Elias said. His voice had a quality that Dae-Hyun recognized, not panic. Elias didn't panic, but the closest thing to it that Elias was capable of, which was a very tight, very controlled urgency. It's parked at the Gowanus waterfront, the industrial section, south end. Everything went quiet in Dae-Hyun's chest. The Gowanus waterfront at 1:30 in the morning. An isolated industrial stretch. Victor's phone going to voicemail. Go, Dae-Hyun said to his driver, and gave him the address, and his voice came out with a steadiness that he did not entirely feel, because he understood now what Thomas Lim had already decided, and he understood that the next 30 minutes were going to determine whether 11 years of a man's complicated, flawed, frightened loyalty ended in a parking lot by dark water, or whether it ended somewhere with more light than that. As fast as you can, he said. The car pulled into traffic and accelerated south. and Dae-Hyun Kwan, who had spent his entire adult life believing that power meant never being the one running toward something, instead of away from it, pressed his hand flat against the window and watched the city blur past, and allowed himself, for the first time in as long as he could remember, to be afraid of arriving too late. The Gowanus waterfront at 1:40 in the morning smelled like industrial salt and old metal and the particular cold that comes off dark water when the wind is moving wrong. Dae-Hyun's driver killed the headlights 2 blocks out without being told to. He had worked for Dae-Hyun for 6 years, and he understood, from the quality of silence in the back seat during the drive down, that arriving loudly was not the objective. They rolled to a stop on a gravel access road that ran parallel to the water. 50 yards ahead, Victor's car sat at the edge of the lot, a dark sedan, engine off, no interior light. Dae-Hyun was out of the car before it fully stopped. He didn't run. Running made noise, and he needed to understand the geometry of what he was walking into before he altered it. He moved fast and low along the fence line, gravel shifting under his shoes with a sound he tried to minimize by shifting his weight forward onto his toes. The lot was bordered on 3 sides by chain link and on the 4th by the water. A rusted loading dock jutted out over the canal to his left. 2 cargo containers sat on the far end of the lot, stacked, their paint peeling in long strips. Between Victor's car and the containers, there was open ground, maybe 30 yards of it, and on that open ground there were 3 figures. Dae-Hyun stopped. He pressed himself against the fence and looked. Victor was on his feet, barely. His jacket was gone. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. His hands were at his sides, and he was holding them slightly away from his body, the way people hold their hands when something hurts, and they're trying not to move it further. His face, even from this distance, had the gray look of a man in a significant amount of pain. 2 men stood between Victor and the water. One of them was larger, wide in the shoulders, wearing a dark jacket, and he was holding something that Dae-Hyun couldn't fully see from this angle, but which caught the ambient light from the distant bridge in a way that left no ambiguity about what it was. The third figure was on a phone, turned slightly away, talking. Dae-Hyun's own phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. Elias, almost certainly. He pressed it to silent without looking at it. He looked at the geometry again. Victor. 2 men. 30 yards of open ground between the fence line and where they were standing. The dock to the left. The containers to the right. He thought about what Colton had said about Thomas Lim becoming unpredictable when cornered. He thought about how unpredictability, when it had money and reach behind it, looked exactly like this. 2 men at a waterfront at 2 in the morning with a solution to a problem that had become inconvenient. He pulled out his phone, typed to Elias, Gowanus South Lot. 2 men with Victor. I need Colton's people here in 10 minutes. Come in from the North Access Road, no lights. He sent it. Pocketed the phone. Looked at the open ground between himself and Victor, and understood that 10 minutes was not a timeline Victor had. The large man had moved closer to Victor. The third figure was still on the phone, gesturing with his free hand, making some kind of point to whoever was on the other end. Victor's head dropped slightly, like it was getting heavy. Dae-Hyun stepped away from the fence. He walked across the open ground. He didn't run, and he didn't hide, and he didn't call out. He walked at the pace of a man who had already decided what he was doing, which he had, because the alternative was watching an 11-year employee die at a waterfront, because a 63-year-old man in New Jersey had decided he was more useful gone than alive. And Dae-Hyun was finished letting Thomas Lim decide what was useful. The large man saw him first. He turned. His partner, the one on the phone, went still, and then turned as well, pulling the phone from his ear in a single sharp motion. Victor raised his head, looked across the lot at Dae-Hyun. His face did something complicated. Kwan, the large man said. Not a question. He said it the way you say a name when you've been told to expect someone and didn't. Step away from him, Dae-Hyun said. His voice was conversational. Not loud. The night around them was quiet enough that it carried without needing to be loud. The large man didn't step away. He repositioned, slightly instead, weight shifting, a practiced adjustment, and Dae-Hyun tracked the object in his hand and confirmed what he already knew. You walked in here alone, the second man said. He had an accent Dae-Hyun couldn't immediately place something mid-Atlantic, somewhere that had ironed out its original geography. He was shorter than his partner, in his 40s, with a face that was difficult to read. That's interesting. I'm not alone, Dae-Hyun said. I'm the part of my team that's visible. A beat while both men assessed this. The second man put his phone in his jacket pocket. Mr. Lim wants... I know what Mr. Lim wants. Dae-Hyun stopped walking. He was 15 feet from Victor now, close enough to see the cut above Victor's left eyebrow, the way his right arm was held slightly wrong, the blood on his collar. Mr. Lim has wanted the same thing for 23 years. That's a long time to want something. He looked at the large man. Put it down. You put it down. The large man looked at his partner. In that moment, the half second when both men were looking at each other, instead of at Dae-Hyun, Victor moved. He lurched sideways, away from the large man, one hand coming up to grab the man's weapon arm at the wrist, the grip clumsy because his right arm wasn't working right, but it was enough. The large man's arm was pulled wide. The second man moved toward them, and Dae-Hyun was already crossing the remaining 15 feet. He hit the second man at the shoulder, driving him sideways, momentum, carrying both of them 2 steps before the man found his footing and swung back. Punch caught Dae-Hyun across the left cheekbone, hard, precise. The punch of someone who knew how to throw one, and Dae-Hyun felt his head snap right and his vision white out for a fraction of a second. He did not go down. He grabbed the man's jacket with both hands and used his own forward momentum to take him into the fence. The chain link hit the man's back with a sound like a struck instrument, loud in the night air, and the man grunted and swung again. But the angle was wrong and it glanced off Dae-Hyun's shoulder instead of his face. Behind him, Victor and the large man were struggling on the ground. Dae-Hyun drove his elbow into the second man's sternum. Once hard. The man folded not down, but forward, all the air leaving him at once, and Dae-Hyun stepped back and put his hand flat on the man's chest and pushed him down to the gravel and held him there with one hand, kneeling. Stay, he said. His cheekbone was screaming. He could feel it swelling already, could feel the heat of it moving up toward his eye. He looked back. Victor was on the ground on his back. The large man was on his feet, breathing hard, the weapon back in his hand, pointed at Victor on the ground. Dae-Hyun stood up slowly. You shoot him, Dae-Hyun said. The next sound you hear will be federal investigators who are 2 minutes away, deciding whether they want to bring you in or just let the paperwork reflect what they found at this location. He paused. Thomas Lim is not going to be in a position to protect you from that answer. He's not going to be in a position to protect anyone from anything in approximately 2 hours. You have until then to decide which side of this you want to be on. The large man's hand wasn't shaking. That was the thing about professionals, they didn't shake. They just calculated. He calculated for 4 seconds. Then he lowered his arm. He looked at his partner, still on the ground, still getting his breath back. Then he looked at Dae-Hyun. This isn't over, he said. No, Dae-Hyun agreed. But you're done with the part where you're useful to it. The large man grabbed his partner by the jacket sleeve and pulled him to his feet, and the two of them walked away from the lot without running, because professionals didn't run either, and disappeared into the dark gap between 2 industrial buildings. Dae-Hyun stood for a moment, listened to the sound of their footsteps fade. Then he walked to Victor. Victor was lying on his back on the gravel, staring at the sky. His breathing was audible, not desperate, but effortful, the breathing of someone managing pain. Dae-Hyun crouched beside him. How bad, he said. Ribs, Victor said. Maybe 1, maybe 2. And my arm. He paused to breathe. My arm is wrong. Can you stand? Give me a minute. Dae-Hyun gave him a minute. He sat on the gravel beside Victor Han, his employee, his betrayer, the man who had been cornered by fear and had made a catastrophic choice and had spent 8 months living inside the consequences of it, and they both looked at the sky above the Gowanus waterfront. You came here yourself, Victor said. Yes. Why didn't you just call? There wasn't time. Victor turned his head slightly to look at him. The cut above his eyebrow was bleeding in a slow, steady way. Why are you here at all? For me? Dae-Hyun looked at the sky. because you were afraid, and you made a wrong decision, and I understand both of those things better than you'd think. Victor was quiet. They forged your signature, Dae-Hyun said. I know that now. We have the audit trail. The silence that followed had a particular quality. Dae-Hyun felt Victor's breathing change, not faster, not slower, but different. The difference of something released. I didn't know if you'd believe me, Victor said. I know. If I'd come to you, I know. Dae-Hyun looked at him. You should have come to me. That's true regardless of what you thought might happen. You should have come to me. A pause. I'm also aware that I built an organization where coming to me with something like that felt like a risk you couldn't calculate. That's on me. Victor closed his eyes. Gravel crunched at the north end of the lot. Dae-Hyun looked up. 3 vehicles, no headlights, moving in carefully. They stopped at the lot's edge, and doors opened, and figures came out, and one of them was Elias, moving fast, and behind Elias were 2 people in jackets that did not say federal on them, but carried that energy unmistakably. Elias reached them, and crouched. He looked at Victor, then at Dae-Hyun's face. Your cheek, Elias said. I know. I know what it looks like. Dae-Hyun stood. His knees registered the gravel in a way they wouldn't have 10 years ago. He pressed 2 fingers lightly to his cheekbone and assessed the damage, and then stopped pressing, because that was pointless. It's pointless. Victor needs medical. 2 possible cracked ribs, and his arm is injured. One of the federal-adjacent figures was already on a radio. The other had walked to where the 2 men had disappeared and was looking into the darkness with the focused attention of someone cataloging what they could see. Colton arrived 4 minutes later in a separate car. He was in a jacket over a shirt that suggested he had not been in bed when he got the call. He looked at the lot, at Victor on the ground, at Dae-Hyun's face, and put together the picture without being walked through it. The 2 men, Colton said, gone south. 2 minutes head start. Dae-Hyun described them, quickly, precisely. Colton relayed it into a radio. Lim's people, Colton said. Yes. He escalated. He panicked. Same thing at his level. Dae-Hyun looked at Colton. James Cho. You need him before morning. We're moving on Cho at 5 a.m. Move earlier. Mr. Kwan, if Lim's people just failed to close this problem, Dae-Hyun said, keeping his voice level, keeping the urgency below the surface, where it was easier to hear, then Lim knows within the hour that it didn't work. The next thing he reaches for is the inside connection. He reaches for James. He looked at Colton steadily. James has 14 years of knowledge of our security architecture. If he decides to disappear before 5 a.m., with what he knows about our backup systems and our documentation trails, that creates complications for both of us. Colton held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned to the person on the radio. Move the Cho operation up, he said. Execute at 3:30. He turned back to Dae-Hyun. The full cooperation package, Colton said. Everything we discussed. That's still on the table from your end? Yes. Including Lim? You can put Lim to us? I can give you 23 years of a relationship with Thomas Lim and a clear financial trail from his New Jersey operation to the shell accounts that funded this network. Dae-Hyun paused. I need something in return. We've discussed something additional. He looked toward Victor, who was being helped to a sitting position by Elias. Victor Hahn was coerced through forged documentation. Cooperation tonight, his willingness to be in that office. When Elias came to him, his disclosure of the safety deposit box represents genuine cooperation under circumstances that mitigate his culpability significantly. I need that on record, not as a favor, as an accurate description of what happened. Colton studied him. You're advocating for a man who helped dismantle your company. I'm telling you an accurate description of what happened. Dae-Hyun met his eyes. That's what I'm offering you, accurate descriptions of what happened. I'd like the same in return. A pause. On record, Colton said. Yes, Colton nodded once on record by 3 a.m. The lot had become something else. There were vehicles and personnel and the particular organized activity of a situation being officially processed, and Dae-Hyun stood slightly outside all of it, at the edge of the dock, looking at the canal. The water was dark and perfectly still in the way water gets when the wind drops. He could see the underside of the bridge reflected in it, the lights wavering slightly at the edges. Elias came and stood beside him. They stood without speaking for almost 2 minutes. James Cho, Elias said finally, 14 years. Yes. Did you ever? No. Dae-Hyun looked at the water. Which tells me something. Thomas Lim built the approach carefully enough that there was nothing visible. James was worth protecting because he was invisible. A brief pause. I should have built an organization where being invisible required more. You're dismantling it. What's left of it? Elias turned to look at him. Dae-Hyun, your face. Stop mentioning my face. It needs to be looked at. After what? Dae-Hyun looked out at the water. In 4 hours, if Colton's people moved at 3:30, James Cho would be in custody and the inside channel of Thomas Lim's network would be severed at its root. The financial evidence Dae-Hyun had agreed to provide would start moving through the federal system, and with it, the architecture of 23 years of Lim's patience and 2 years of his construction, taken apart methodically. The way you dismantle something dangerous carefully, with attention to what might still be live. Victor was on his way to a hospital with Elias's driver. He had looked at Dae-Hyun before he got in the car with the expression of a man who didn't have the right language for the moment he was in. Go, Dae-Hyun had told him. We'll talk later. Dae-Hyun. Victor had held the car door. Christening. I was there because I wanted to be there. I want you to know that. Dae-Hyun had looked at him. I know, he had said. Now he stood at the edge of the dock and looked at the still water and thought about his son's christening and about the grand piano in the living room of the mansion that no one played anymore, and about Amara sitting at a battered upright in a Brooklyn practice room after midnight, playing something she had carried in notebooks for 4 years. He thought about what it had cost her to become the woman she was now. Not the cost of leaving, the cost of everything that had preceded the leaving. The decade of slowly diminishing returns on a self that had deserved so much more room than he had given it. He pressed one hand to his swollen cheekbone, felt the ache of it settle into something duller and more permanent. He thought about the letter he was going to write. The one he had been feeling around the edges of. He thought about a sold-out concert hall in 6 weeks. 1,100 seats. A woman in a midnight blue dress who had earned every single one of them. Concert, he said. Elias followed his thinking the way he always had, without needing the middle steps. She has 6 weeks. She has 6 weeks, Dae-Hyun agreed. She doesn't need any of this landing on her before that. And Thomas Lim, Colton has Lim. He lowered his hand from his face. That's what cooperation means. I handed it to people whose job is to carry it. He turned away from the water. For the first time in 25 years, I handed something to someone else and let them carry it. Elias looked at him for a moment. How does that feel? He asked. Dae-Hyun considered it. Like something I should have tried earlier, he said. He walked back across the lot toward the vehicles and the activity and the particular organized machinery of consequences, finally catching up to the shape of things. And behind him the Gowanus Canal sat perfectly still. And the bridge lights wavered in it, and the city held its breath, the way it sometimes did in the last hour before dawn, that specific held-breath quality of a night that has asked too much of too many people, and is nearly done asking. Nearly. In an apartment in Astoria, a man named James Cho was asleep, and he had 90 minutes left of not knowing that his careful 14 years of invisible work had been found in a secondary backup log by the one person who knew it existed. And in a house in New Jersey, a 63-year-old man named Thomas Lim was awake, sitting by a phone that was not ringing, waiting for a call from 2 men who were not going to call, and beginning to understand in the slow, nauseating way that understanding comes when you have spent 23 years being patient, and have finally, catastrophically, run out of time, that the thing he had spent 2 years building had just come apart in a waterfront parking lot in Brooklyn, and that the man he had built it against had changed into someone his entire architecture had failed to account for. Dae-Hyun got in his car. Where now? His driver asked. He looked at the clock on the dash. 3:04 M1100 seats. 6 weeks. A letter he needed to write by hand. Take me somewhere I can buy paper, he said. And a pen. Actual pen. Not a hotel pen. His driver absorbed this without visible reaction, which was one of the things Dae-Hyun valued about him. At 3 in the morning, the driver said, There's a 24-hour drugstore on Atlantic Avenue. The driver pulled out of the lot. The driver pulled out of the lot. Dae-Hyun pressed the back of his hand lightly against his cheekbone and watched the waterfront disappear behind them and thought about the first line of the letter. Not planning it, just feeling where it wanted to start. It wanted to start with the truth. That was, he supposed, the only place anything worth saying had ever actually started. The car moved north through the dark, and the city breathed around it. And somewhere in Brooklyn, a woman who had once been erased was sleeping with ink on her fingers and notebooks on her coffee table, and the particular quiet of someone who had fought their way back to themselves and earned every note of the silence. She didn't know what this night had cost. She didn't need to. She had her own work. And in 6 weeks, 1,100 people were going to sit in the dark and hear exactly what that work had become, and one of them was going to sit in the back row behind a pillar. And finally, after 9 years of not knowing how, listen. The drugstore on Atlantic Avenue was lit up like a small sun in the dark street. And when Dae-Hyun walked in with a bruise spreading across his left cheekbone and bought a legal pad and a black pen from a teenager who did not ask a single question about any of it, he thought that this ordinary, fluorescent, completely unglamorous moment was possibly the most honest thing he had done in years. He got back in the car. He uncapped the pen. He wrote the first line. And the night finally began to move towards something that wasn't darkness. James Cho was arrested at 3:47 in the morning. He came to the door in a gray t-shirt and sweatpants, blinking against the hallway light, and the expression on his face, when he saw the people standing there, was not surprise. It was something closer to relief, the relief of a man who has been waiting for a knock on the door for so long that the waiting had become its own kind of sentence. He didn't say anything. He stepped back from the door. He sat down on his couch and put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor while the agents moved through his apartment. And when Colton sat across from him 20 minutes later in the back of a federal vehicle parked outside his building, James said, without being asked a single question, "I'll tell you everything. I just need to know my wife is not going to be part of this." His wife was in Seoul visiting her mother. She had been there for 3 weeks and was scheduled to return in 4 days. "Your wife has no exposure here," Colton said. James nodded slowly. He looked like a man who had just set down something very heavy. "Okay," he said. "Okay." He talked for 2 hours. Thomas Lim had approached him 4 years ago, not 2. He had been patient enough to spend 2 years building a relationship before he asked for anything, which was the thing James kept coming back to in the federal vehicle, the thing that seemed to trouble him most. Not that he'd been recruited, but how long and how carefully he had been cultivated before the ask arrived. By the time Lim wanted something, James had already accepted 14 dinners, 2 family vacations subsidized through a shell consulting arrangement, and a private school tuition payment for his daughter, disguised as a grant. "I already owed him," James said, before he ever asked. That was the design. Colton wrote notes and said very little and let James construct the picture, because that was how Colton worked. And the picture James constructed was detailed and precise and connected Thomas Lim to 12 years of careful positioning and 4 years of active operation against Quan Meridian's port infrastructure. At 5:15 a.m., a federal team went to Thomas Lim's home in Millburn, New Jersey. Lim was awake. He was dressed. He was sitting in his study with a cup of tea and a leather portfolio on the desk in front of him. And when the agents came through the door, he looked up at them with the face of a man who had been preparing himself for this for several hours and had achieved a kind of cold composure that was either dignity or performance or both. "I'd like to call my attorney," he said. "Of course," the lead agent said. He called. He sat. He said nothing else without his attorney present, and nothing he said after the attorney arrived changed the shape of what was already built around him. The financial trail was too complete. James Cho was too comprehensive. The shell accounts that Elias had traced were too precisely documented. 23 years of patience, and Thomas Lim had miscalculated the one variable he thought he understood best. He had believed that Dae-Hyun Kwan would always be the man his father raised. He had not accounted for what a woman walking out of a marriage with a suitcase and her grandmother's bracelet could change in a person. Sora Min's attorney called Colton's office at 9 a.m. and opened a cooperation discussion. The terms took 3 days to negotiate, but the outline was clear from the first call. Sora would admit that the relationship with Dae-Hyun had been partly engineered, not manufactured from nothing. She had found him genuinely compelling, which she said with a flatness that suggested she had thought carefully about how to frame it, but escalated and made visible at strategic moments to serve the network's objective. She had known Amara's travel schedule. She had known the flight change. She had chosen the robe. She said it without flinching, which was the thing Colton noted in his report. Not remorse exactly. Something more like a person who had made a calculation and was now prepared to account for it with the same precision they'd used to make it. Dae-Hyun read the cooperation summary when Colton sent it to him 4 days later. He read the part about the robe, about the deliberate visibility, about Sora's assessment that destabilizing Amara's confidence in the marriage was operationally useful. He set the document down on the hotel desk. He sat for a long time without moving. Then he picked up the letter he had been writing. The one started on a legal pad from an Atlantic Avenue drugstore at 3 in the morning, and he read what he had already written, and he added 2 more paragraphs. And when he was done, he read the whole thing through once and folded it and addressed the envelope by hand. He did not use what he'd learned about Sora to absolve himself. He had written the letter before he read the summary, and the letter did not change because of the summary, and that was the one thing he felt, in the wreckage of everything else, that he had gotten right. The betrayal was still his choice. He mailed the letter. Amara received it on a Tuesday. She was between sessions. At the center, Frederick had just left, his G to C progression finally smooth enough that she had told him to try G to C to D, the next step, and he had written it down in a small notebook he had started bringing, a detail that made her unreasonably happy. And she was standing in the hallway with a cup of coffee when Patricia appeared with a small stack of mail and said, "This one's handwritten, so I thought you'd want it sooner." Amara looked at the handwriting on the envelope. She knew his handwriting the way you know anything you've lived alongside for a decade. The particular slant of his capital letters, the way he pressed slightly harder on the downstroke. She took the letter to the break room and sat down and opened it. She read it twice. He had not asked for forgiveness. He had not asked her to return. He had written, in 7 pages of small, precise handwriting, what he understood now about what he had done. Not the affair alone, but the longer, quieter erosion that had preceded it. The way he had consumed the space where her life had been. The grand piano that had become furniture. The compositions she had stopped finishing. The woman who had disappeared so gradually that he hadn't noticed, or had noticed, and had not been willing to examine what his own gravity was doing to the person nearest to him. He had written, "I told myself I was protecting you. I built walls around you and called them care. The walls were real. The care was real. The fact that real walls still block the light, that was something I refused to learn until you were gone." He had written, "You owe me nothing. Not your time, not your forgiveness, not even the acknowledgement that I've changed. I am writing this because you deserve to have it in writing. From me, in my own hand, with no performance in it. What I did cost you years. I cannot give those back. But I can tell you clearly that the person who is going to hear you play in 6 weeks is not the person who let you disappear. I don't ask you to believe that. I just needed you to have it on paper." He had ended with, "Your music is the most honest thing I have ever heard. I hope you know what that means, from someone who spent a very long time being dishonest about almost everything." Amara folded the letter, put it back in the envelope. She sat in the break room for 3 minutes, looking at the wall. Then she stood up, rinsed her coffee cup, and went back to work. She had Jonah at 2. He had been, against all odds, attempting a simplified Bach minuet, and he was at the stage where he kept rushing the tempo because sitting with slowness felt unbearable to him. And Amara had spent 2 sessions teaching him that the space between notes was not empty, that what happened in the space between notes was sometimes the whole point. She tucked the letter into her bag. She kept it. The concert was on a Friday night in late November. The venue was a mid-sized hall in Lower Manhattan, not Carnegie, not yet. but the kind of room that serious people filled, the kind with good acoustics and a Steinway grand on a stage that was lit simply, without theater, because the music didn't need theater. 1,100 seats, all of them filled. Malcolm Reeves stood at the back of the hall before the concert began, and he looked at the crowd, not the usual concert crowd, not the established classical audience, but a mix of people who had followed a 4-minute video from a practice room door to a ticketed event, and he felt something that he recognized from his 22 years in the industry as the particular atmosphere of something real about to happen. He had helped Amara prepare for 6 weeks without once telling her what she should be. That had been, he reflected, the most useful thing he had ever done professionally. He had made suggestions and been overruled cheerfully, and had argued for a different arrangement of the set list and been told no with a directness that was almost refreshing. And the album they had built together was the album Amara had been carrying in those composition notebooksy, fully herself, without compromise. He found his seat. The lights dropped. Amara walked onto the stage in a midnight blue dress and her grandmother's gold bracelet. She sat at the Steinway. She looked at the keys for a moment. Just a moment. The way you look at something you have missed. Then she played. The first composition was The Loneliness. She had saved it simply before in the program, and it began very quietly, almost too quietly. You had to lean toward it, and it built without hurrying into something that sat in the chest like a weight you'd been carrying, so long you'd forgotten it was there. 1,100 people went very still. The second piece burned. There was no other word for it. It was the piece with the anger in it, the restrained fury of someone who had been careful for too long. And by the time it reached its center, the sound was physical. You felt it in your sternum. And when it ended, the hall was silent for 3 full seconds before the first person moved. The third piece was grief. Not melodramatic grief, not the grief of performance. The grief of someone sitting at a kitchen table at midnight, understanding something they can never unknow. Tessa, in the 6th row, pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and stared at the stage. Then the fourth, the knot, 2 quiet notes repeating, patient as a heartbeat. Then the composition opened, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way understanding opens, gradually and then completely. Everything in it, the champagne silk robe, the porcelain cup, the black suitcase, the gravel in the rain, the pull-out couch with the bar that found your spine. The first morning she had played scales in the dark. Frederick's hands learning to hold a chord, 4 minutes and 11 seconds through a practice room window. And the ending, she had decided on survival. Not because forgiveness was impossible, she didn't know yet, and the honest answer was, she didn't know yet, but because the piece had been built by the woman who survived, and it needed to end where she actually was. Not where she hoped to be, where she was. The final chord didn't resolve the way classical training would resolve it. It landed somewhere that wasn't quite peace, and wasn't quite pain somewhere true, somewhere that sounded exactly like a woman, who had fought her way back to herself, and was still quietly fighting. The note held, and then released into silence. 1,100 people rose. In the back row behind a pillar in seat J119, Dae-Hyun Kwon sat. He did not stand immediately. He sat for several seconds, while the ovation built around him, while the hall filled with the sound of 1,100 people responding to something that had moved through them. And he looked at the stage where Amara stood receiving it, not performing the receiving, just standing there, slightly surprised in the way you're surprised when something you made privately turns out to belong to other people too. He thought about the letter. He thought about 9 years. He stood. The bruise on his cheekbone had faded to a yellowish shadow. His left eye still looked slightly wrong, if you knew to look. He stood in the back row behind a pillar and put his hands together, and was one of 1,100 people in the room who understood something about Amara Vance that he should have understood years ago. And the difference between him and the other 1,100 was that he had been the one with the power to do something about it, and had instead become the obstacle she wrote the music around. 3 standing ovations. He waited. Backstage was controlled chaos for 20 minutes, the particular chaos of a performance that went beyond expectations. People moving fast, flowers appearing, Malcolm with his jacket slightly rumpled, talking to someone with a recording device. The kind of happy disorder that meant something had worked. Amara stood in it and let it happen around her. When the initial rush thinned, he was there. He had come around the side entrance, not the main backstage corridor. He had known this venue when it was a different venue, and the side entrance was a detail from before. From a benefit concert Amara had played here 7 years ago, when she was still his wife. He had attended then too. He had stood in the back then too, but for different reasons. Then it had been because his phone needed attention. She saw him before he spoke. She looked at his face, the shadow of the bruise. "What happened to your face?" she said. "It's a long story. Are you all right?" "Yes." He paused. "Are you?" She considered the question. Not as a formality, genuinely considered it the way she considered everything now, with the full weight of her attention. "Yes," she said. "I think I actually am." He nodded. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable. The silence of two people who had said the necessary things already him on 7 pages of legal pad paper, her in 4 compositions, and were now standing in the aftermath of having finally, actually communicated. "Your music is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," he said. She studied him, the way she studied things directly, without softening it. "Why were you hiding in the back?" she said. "I wasn't there to be seen." "Then why were you there?" "To listen." A pause. "I was there to listen." Something shifted in her face. "Small, but real. You got my letter," he said. Not a question. "Yes, you didn't respond." "No." She met his eyes. "I didn't know how to respond to something that didn't ask for anything. It wasn't supposed to ask for anything." "I know." She looked at him for a long moment. "I've fought too hard to get back to myself to walk back into your orbit, because you're sorry, Dae-Hyun." "I know. I'm not the same person who left." "I know that too." "Then what are you here for?" He was quiet for a beat. Not because he didn't have the answer, but because the answer was simple enough that he wanted to say it without it sounding like a performance. "I wanted you to know," he said, "that the man who should have been listening for 9 years was finally in the room." The backstage noise continued around them. Someone calling for Malcolm, a door opening and closing, the particular live electricity of an evening that had mattered still crackling through the space. Amara looked at him. "Go home, Dae-Hyun," she said. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he nodded. He walked out the side entrance without argument, without negotiation, without one last word designed to tip the balance. He walked out because she had asked him to, and because for the first time in his life, he understood that leaving when someone needed you to leave was not a defeat. It was the first honest thing he had done in 9 years in her direction. The months that followed were not cinematic. They were ordinary in the way real change is ordinary, incremental, imperfect, frequently uncomfortable. The Quan Meridian investigation ran through the fall and into winter. The legitimate operations were separated and restructured under new compliance frameworks that Elias oversaw with the particular thoroughness of a man who had spent 20 years operating in shadows, and was now, with some relief, working in the light. The criminal structure that had underlain the business for 30 years was dismantled piece by piece, and it was not clean, and it was not fast. And there were days when Dae-Hyun sat across from lawyers and federal liaisons and felt the full accumulated weight of every decision that had brought him to that table. He sold the mansion. He moved into the West Village apartment permanently. He removed the armed detail. He learned to cook 3 things adequately and burned 2 of them with some regularity. Victor Han entered a cooperation agreement that reflected on record that his initial involvement had been coerced. He pled to a reduced charge. He spent 4 months in a minimum security facility in upstate New York and was released in the spring. His daughter visited him twice while he was there, both times bringing the same thermos of coffee. The second time, she played him a voice memo on her phone of a new piece she'd learned. He listened to the whole thing without saying a word. Thomas Lim was indicted on 14 counts. His attorney was good and the proceedings were slow and the outcome was not swift, but the financial evidence was complete enough that swift was not necessary. The case would find its conclusion in its own time. James Cho cooperated fully. His wife came home from Seoul to a different life than the one she'd left, and she sat across from her husband at their kitchen table and listened to all of it. And when he finished, she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "We're going to have to figure out what comes next." "I know," James said. "I'm not ready to tell you it's okay." "I know, but I'm here," she said, "still here." He put his hand over hers on the table. She let him. The knot was released in January. The critical reception used words like unflinching and essential, and a debut that sounds like nothing else because it was made by someone who had nothing left to protect. It entered the streaming charts at a number that surprised the label people who had wanted to be involved and been declined. It surprised Malcolm, who had believed in it completely, and was still surprised by what completely believing in something actually looked like when it landed. It did not surprise Amara, because she had not made it to be received. She had made it because it needed to exist. The reception was separate from the making, and she kept them carefully separate in her mind, because she understood that conflating them was how you lost the thread back to the reason you started. She bought an apartment in Brooklyn, 3rd floor, good light. She bought a piano, a refurbished upright, not because she couldn't afford a grand, but because the uprights at the center and at Tessa's had done something to her relationship with instruments, had shown her that what she needed was not grandeur, but presence. Piano lived against the wall where the light hit it in the afternoons, and she played it every morning before she did anything else. She kept teaching. Frederick progressed through the winter with the patience of a man who had already proven he had it, and by March he was playing a simple piece from memory, haltingly but whole, and he played it for his daughter over a video call, and his daughter cried in the way that adult children cry when their parents surprise them. She was in her apartment in late February when her phone lit up with Dae-Hyun's name. She looked at it for a moment. She answered. "I have a residency," she said, without waiting for him to speak first. "6 nights, starting in April. I wanted you to hear it from me." Pause on his end. "Can I come? Not behind a pillar." "No," he said. "No pillar." She told him about the residency. He told her, in return, and with no particular drama, about the restructuring, about a board meeting that had lasted 6 hours, about burning pasta on a Tuesday night and discovering he had no working smoke alarm. She told him about Frederick learning to play something whole. He told her he had started going to the farmer's market on Saturdays because the West Village ones was close and he had nothing else specific to do on Saturdays, which was a sentence she would not have believed from him 2 years ago. They talked for 2 hours. It felt like talking. Just that. Two people who had damaged each other and survived the damage and were, carefully, learning something new about how to occupy the same space. She did not invite him over. He did not ask. When they said goodnight, there was no subtext in it. Just two people getting off the phone because it was late and they both had things in the morning. She set her phone on the nightstand and lay in the dark for a while, listening to the particular sounds of her own apartment, the refrigerator, the pipes, the muffled sound of the street 3 floors below. Apartment. Her sounds. She had a piano against the wall and ink on her bedside table from notes she'd written before sleep and a schedule that belonged entirely to her, and none of it was simple, and none of it was without the sediment of everything that had happened, but it was hers in a way that nothing had been hers in a very long time. In April, on the second night of the residency, Dae-Hyun sat in the 7th row. Not the back, not behind anything. The 7th row, center, and when the lights dropped and Amara walked onto the stage, and her eyes moved across the audience in that brief habitual scan that performers do before they begin, they found him. And they held for a second, just a second, and then she sat down at the piano and placed her hands and began. He sat with his phone in his pocket. He did not check it once. He listened to every note and every silence, and the silence between the notes was something he was learning to hear now, was learning to understand held as much as the notes themselves, maybe more that the spaces were not empty, that what happened in the spaces between sounds was sometimes the whole point. After, they had dinner at the small Queen's restaurant, the same one from before money had made everything complicated. The menus were laminated and the lighting was bad, and the food was exactly what it had always been, which was honest and filling and without pretension. Dae-Hyun's mother joined them. She was 77 and had always liked Amara with a directness that bypassed sentiment, not warmth exactly, but something more durable than warmth, a kind of recognition. She had called Amara after the album came out and said, in Korean and without ceremony, "I heard it. Good. This is what you should have been doing." And Amara had laughed, genuinely, because that was exactly what his mother would say and exactly what was needed. After dinner, they went back to the small apartment where his mother lived, which had a battered upright piano that she had owned for 40 years, and played badly and loved enormously. And Amara sat down at it and began playing something new, the beginning of the second album, still in fragments, not ready, but alive. Dae-Hyun sat in the chair by the window. His phone sat on the table beside him untouched. His mother fell asleep in her armchair, with the expression of someone who had decided this was acceptable and was done thinking about it. The music moved through the small apartment. Amara played until the fragment gave out, until she reached the place where it wasn't written yet, and her hands slowed and found the last chord and held it, and the chord dissolved slowly into the room's air. In the silence that followed, Dae-Hyun extended his hand across the small distance between his chair and the piano bench. He stopped with his hand halfway open, offered, not reaching, not taking. Amara looked at it. She looked at him. The wedding ring was in a box in her apartment. She had not erased anything. She had not forgotten any of it: the kitchen, the robe, the knot, the rain on her face, while she stood with a suitcase waiting for a car. She carried all of it, would probably always carry some of it, and that was the truth of what surviving something left you with. But the man in the chair was not the man from that night, and she was not the woman who had walked out into the rain. They were two different people who had been through the worst of themselves and come out the other side, still standing, which was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a lot. She placed her hand in his. Not restoration, not erasure, not a return to anything that had existed before. Something slower than that. Something that knew what it cost and was choosing to continue anyway, without certainty, without guarantees, with both eyes open. The piano's last vibration finally disappeared. His mother breathed steadily in her chair. Outside, the city made its ordinary sounds. And in the quiet that settled over that small room, there was something that had not been there before. Not peace exactly, not yet, but the first real possibility of it. Kind that only comes after. You've stopped pretending the damage isn't real and started learning to build something new in the same hands that made it. That was enough. For tonight, that was enough.